The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Renaissance Florence as Lorenzo de' Medici's messenger hurried through the narrow streets, carrying news that would forever change how we understand the art of responding to humiliation. It was 1513, and Niccolò Machiavelli, recently exiled from political life, was about to witness an event that would crystallize his most profound insights into human nature and the mechanics of power. In the Grand Palazzo where Lorenzo held court, a young nobleman named Alessandro had just been publicly humiliated by his rival, Francesco, who had exposed Alessandro's failed business ventures before the assembled elite of Florence. The room fell silent as Alessandro's face burned with shame, his reputation seemingly shattered in an instant. Most expected him to either explode in rage or retreat in defeat. Instead, Alessandro did something extraordinary, something that would later inspire Machiavelli's darkest and most effective strategy for responding to humiliation. What Alessandro understood, and what Machiavelli would later codify into timeless wisdom, was that humiliation is not merely an attack on one's dignity, it is a strategic move in the eternal game of power. How one responds to such attacks determines not just the immediate outcome, but the entire trajectory of future relationships, opportunities, and influence. The conventional responses to humiliation, immediate retaliation, emotional breakdown, or submissive withdrawal, are exactly what the aggressor expects and desires. They play directly into the humiliator's hands, granting them the very satisfaction and advantage they sought to achieve. Machiavelli observed that those who truly understood power operated by different rules entirely. They recognized that humiliation, like every other challenge in life, was an opportunity disguised as a threat. The key was not to react from emotion, but to respond from calculation. Not to seek immediate satisfaction, but long-term dominance. Not to address the surface insult, but to understand the deeper game being played. The strategy that emerged from Machiavelli's observations was revolutionary in its simplicity and devastating in its effectiveness. It required a complete inversion of natural human instincts, transforming the moment of greatest vulnerability into a position of ultimate strength. This was not about turning the other cheek, nor was it about plotting elaborate revenge. It was something far more sophisticated and psychologically devastating to one's enemies. Alessandro's response that day in Lorenzo's court became legendary. As Francesco basked in the apparent success of his attack, expecting either submission or retaliation, Alessandro smiled calmly and began to speak. What he said, and how he said it, would become the template for Machiavelli's most powerful strategy for dealing with humiliation. The young nobleman had intuitively grasped what Machiavelli would later articulate as the fundamental principle: when someone humiliates you, they have revealed their own weakness, not yours. To understand Machiavelli's strategy, one must first understand the true nature of humiliation itself. In the grand theater of human interaction, humiliation serves a specific function. It is an attempt to establish dominance by forcing another person into a position of perceived weakness. The humiliator seeks to elevate themselves by diminishing another, to gain power by taking it from someone else. This is not random cruelty, it is strategic warfare disguised as social interaction. Francesco's attack on Alessandro was not born from spontaneous anger or righteous indignation. It was a calculated move designed to eliminate a rival from the social and political landscape of Florence. By exposing Alessandro's business failures in such a public manner, Francesco hoped to accomplish several objectives simultaneously: destroy Alessandro's reputation, establish himself as the dominant figure in their social circle, gain favor with Lorenzo by appearing knowledgeable and well-informed, and create a psychological victory that would demoralize Alessandro and prevent future challenges. This multi-layered nature of humiliation is what makes it such a powerful weapon, and why the conventional responses to it are so ineffective. When someone lashes out in anger, they appear unstable and vindictive, actually reinforcing the humiliator's implied superiority. When someone retreats in shame, they validate the attack and grant the humiliator exactly the victory they sought. When someone attempts immediate retaliation, they often appear petty and desperate, diminishing themselves further in the eyes of observers. Machiavelli recognized that each of these responses shared a fatal flaw: they were reactive rather than strategic. They addressed the immediate emotional impact of the humiliation rather than the underlying power dynamic it represented. They focused on the surface insult rather than the deeper game being played. Most critically, they allowed the humiliator to control the narrative and dictate the terms of engagement. The true genius of Machiavelli's approach lay in his understanding that humiliation only works if the target accepts the frame of reference imposed by the attacker. Francesco's attack relied on the assumption that business failure was inherently shameful and that public exposure of such failure would damage Alessandro's standing. But what if Alessandro refused to accept that frame? What if he responded from an entirely different context that rendered Francesco's attack not just ineffective, but actually harmful to Francesco himself? Alessandro's response that day demonstrated the first principle of Machiavelli's strategy: never accept the terms of engagement imposed by your humiliator. Instead of defending his business ventures or making excuses for their failure, Alessandro shifted the entire conversation to a different level. He began by thanking Francesco for his concern about his business affairs, noting that it showed how closely Francesco had been following his activities. This single statement transformed the entire dynamic of the interaction. By expressing gratitude for Francesco's concern, Alessandro reframed the attack as unwanted but well-intentioned advice. By noting how closely Francesco had been watching him, he subtly implied that Francesco was obsessed with his activities, the behavior of an inferior tracking a superior, not an equal challenging an equal. The shift was so subtle and seemingly gracious that Francesco could not object without appearing churlish, yet so profound that it completely undermined the intended effect of his attack. But Alessandro was just beginning. He continued by acknowledging that yes, his recent ventures had not succeeded as planned, but that this was simply part of the natural process of learning and growth that any person of ambition must undergo. He spoke of failure not as a source of shame, but as a mark of courage, the inevitable consequence of daring to attempt great things rather than settling for mediocrity. This reframing was devastating to Francesco's position. Where Francesco had tried to present failure as evidence of incompetence, Alessandro presented it as evidence of boldness. Where Francesco implied that business setbacks reflected poor judgment, Alessandro suggested they reflected ambitious vision. Most importantly, Alessandro's calm acceptance of his failures and his philosophical perspective on them made Francesco's attack appear not just unsuccessful, but actually petty and small-minded. The assembled nobles began to see this situation differently. Francesco, who moments before had appeared cleverly informed and righteously critical, now seemed like someone who spent his time obsessing over other people's affairs and took pleasure in their difficulties. Alessandro, who had initially appeared humiliated and defeated, now seemed mature, thoughtful, and secure in himself, the kind of man who could acknowledge setbacks without being diminished by them. Machiavelli observed this transformation with fascination. He saw how Alessandro had not merely deflected an attack, but had used it as an opportunity to demonstrate exactly the qualities that made him a formidable individual. His response revealed intelligence, emotional control, philosophical depth, and social grace. By contrast, Francesco's attack, when viewed through Alessandro's reframing, revealed pettiness, obsession, mean-spiritedness, and lack of vision. This was the essence of Machiavelli's first insight: humiliation attempts to force you into a position of weakness, but they simultaneously require the humiliator to reveal their own character. When someone attacks you publicly, they expose their willingness to harm others for personal gain. When someone seeks to embarrass you, they demonstrate their own insecurity and need for validation. When someone attempts to diminish you, they reveal their belief that they can only rise by pushing others down. The key to Alessandro's success was his recognition that Francesco's attack was not really about him at all, it was about Francesco. It revealed Francesco's fears, insecurities, and limitations. A secure, confident person does not need to humiliate others to feel good about themselves. A person with genuine accomplishments does not need to highlight other people's failures to seem successful. A person with real power does not need to engage in petty social warfare to maintain their position. Alessandro understood this intuitively and used it to devastating effect. By responding with grace and wisdom, he forced the assembled nobles to see the stark contrast between his character and Francesco's. The humiliation attempt backfired completely, elevating Alessandro in everyone's estimation while diminishing Francesco. But Machiavelli saw something even deeper in this exchange. Alessandro had not merely defended himself successfully, he had transformed a moment of apparent weakness into a demonstration of strength. He had taken Francesco's attempt to control the narrative and used it to tell a completely different story, one in which Alessandro emerged as the hero and Francesco as the villain. This transformation was possible because Alessandro understood the fundamental truth that Machiavelli would later articulate: the person who attempts to humiliate you is already lost, regardless of how the situation appears on the surface. They have revealed their own weakness and desperation. They have shown themselves to be the kind of person who attacks others rather than building themselves up. They have demonstrated that they see you as enough of a threat to warrant their attention and energy. Machiavelli realized that this principle could be generalized into a comprehensive strategy for dealing with all forms of humiliation and attack. The key was not to react defensively to the surface content of the humiliation, but to recognize the deeper psychological and social dynamics at play and respond at that level instead. The second phase of Machiavelli's strategy involves what he termed the inversion, the process of transforming the humiliator's apparent advantage into their actual disadvantage. This goes beyond simply deflecting an attack. It requires using the attack itself as ammunition for a counteroffensive that is all the more devastating because it appears generous and gracious rather than vindictive. Alessandro demonstrated this principle brilliantly in the continuation of his response to Francesco. After reframing the attack as concern and his failures as learning experiences, he moved to the next level of the strategy. He began to speak about Francesco himself, but in terms that seemed complimentary while actually being devastating. Alessandro noted how fortunate Francesco was to have avoided the kind of ambitious projects that sometimes fail. He spoke admiringly of Francesco's caution and prudence, his careful avoidance of risks that might damage his reputation. He praised Francesco's wisdom in building a solid foundation before attempting anything too bold or innovative. To the casual observer, Alessandro appeared to be graciously returning Francesco's concern with genuine compliments. But, to anyone listening carefully, the subtext was unmistakable. Francesco was being portrayed as someone so risk-averse and unambitious that failure was impossible because he never attempted anything significant enough to fail at. The genius of this approach lay in its precision targeting of Francesco's underlying insecurities. Francesco had attacked Alessandro's business failures, but this implicitly raised the question of Francesco's own business activities. Where were Francesco's ventures? What risks had he taken? What innovations had he attempted? By praising Francesco's caution and prudence, Alessandro forced everyone present to consider these questions. The assembled nobles began to realize that Francesco, despite his criticism of Alessandro's failures, had never attempted anything comparable himself. He was in the position of someone who criticized the performance of gladiators from the safety of the stands, someone whose opinion carried little weight precisely because he had never faced similar challenges himself. This was the essence of Machiavelli's inversion strategy: when someone attacks your failures, highlight their lack of attempts. When someone criticizes your methods, examine their results. When someone questions your judgment, investigate their experience. The humiliator believes they are exposing your weakness, but they are actually revealing their own. Alessandro continued this line of subtle attack by expressing his hope that Francesco would eventually find the courage to attempt some of the more ambitious projects that Alessandro himself had pursued. He offered to share his experience and insights, noting that failure, while painful, taught lessons that could not be learned any other way. He suggested that Francesco's careful nature would actually be an advantage in such ventures, as he would be unlikely to make the kind of impulsive mistakes that sometimes led to setbacks. This apparent offer of mentorship was perhaps the most devastating element of Alessandro's response. It positioned him as the experienced veteran offering guidance to the inexperienced newcomer. It implied that Francesco's attacks came from ignorance rather than malice, the naive criticism of someone who had never faced real challenges himself. The social dynamic in the room had now completely reversed. Francesco, who had begun the exchange as the confident attacker, was now in the position of needing to defend his own accomplishments and experience. Alessandro, who had initially appeared to be the vulnerable target, was now the magnanimous expert offering to help a less experienced colleague. Machiavelli observed how this transformation occurred not through any direct contradiction of Francesco's statements, but through a subtle shift in perspective that revealed those statements in an entirely different light. Alessandro had not denied his business failures or made excuses for them. Instead, he had changed the context in which they were interpreted, transforming them from evidence of incompetence into proof of ambitious engagement with challenging endeavors. This is the heart of the inversion strategy. Rather than fighting the facts presented by your humiliator, you change the framework within which those facts are understood. The humiliator expects you to either deny their claims or become defensive about them. Instead, you accept their claims completely while demonstrating that they actually support a conclusion opposite to the one the humiliator intended. Francesco's attack had been based on the assumption that business failure was inherently shameful and that highlighting such failure would diminish Alessandro's standing. Alessandro's response revealed that assumption as narrow and small-minded. He demonstrated that from a more mature and experienced perspective, business failure was simply one aspect of an active and ambitious life, far more respectable than the cautious inaction that characterized Francesco's approach. But Machiavelli noticed that Alessandro's strategy went deeper than simply reframing his own situation. He was also systematically undermining the basis of Francesco's social position. Francesco's attack had been possible only because he occupied a certain standing in the court hierarchy. But that standing was based partly on the perception that he was knowledgeable, discerning, and sophisticated. Alessandro's response called all of these qualities into question. By revealing Francesco's comments as naive and inexperienced, Alessandro damaged Francesco's reputation for insight. By showing Francesco's approach as excessively cautious and unambitious, Alessandro undermined Francesco's reputation for sophistication. By demonstrating the mean-spirited nature of Francesco's attack, Alessandro exposed Francesco's lack of genuine class and dignity. The other nobles present began to reassess their opinion of Francesco. They had previously seen him as sharp and well-informed, but now they wondered whether his information came from productive engagement with the world or from gossipy observation of others' activities. They had thought of him as successful, but now they questioned whether his success came from genuine accomplishment or from careful avoidance of challenging opportunities. This erosion of Francesco's standing was all the more devastating because it appeared to be an unintended consequence of Alessandro's gracious response rather than a deliberate attack. Alessandro seemed to be genuinely trying to be generous and helpful, which made the undermining effect all the more powerful. No one could accuse Alessandro of being vindictive or petty, yet Francesco's position was being systematically destroyed. Machiavelli recognized this as the ultimate expression of strategic thinking, achieving your objectives while appearing to have entirely different, more noble motivations. Alessandro was conducting a devastating social and political attack while seeming to offer friendship and mentorship. He was destroying an enemy while appearing to help a colleague. The strategy worked because it operated on multiple levels simultaneously. On the surface, Alessandro was being gracious and constructive. At a deeper level, he was systematically undermining everything Francesco had hoped to accomplish with his attack. And, at the deepest level, he was repositioning himself as the kind of person who could transform even hostile attacks into opportunities for demonstrating wisdom and generosity. This multi-layered approach is what made the strategy so devastatingly effective. Francesco could not object to Alessandro's response without appearing ungrateful and churlish. He could not continue his attack without seeming petty and obsessive. He could not retreat without validating Alessandro's implied superiority. Alessandro had created a situation in which any move Francesco might make would only worsen his position. Machiavelli saw that this trap was not accidental but was the inevitable result of approaching humiliation strategically rather than emotionally. When you respond to attack with wisdom rather than anger, with generosity rather than defensiveness, with long-term thinking rather than immediate reaction, you create a dynamic in which your attacker's aggression works against them rather than for them. Part 3, The Long Game of Power. The final phase of Machiavelli's strategy involves understanding that true victory over humiliation extends far beyond the immediate confrontation. While Alessandro had already achieved a tactical victory in his exchange with Francesco, the real power of his approach would become apparent in the days, weeks, and months that followed. Machiavelli observed that the most sophisticated practitioners of power understood that how you handle humiliation determines not just the outcome of a single encounter, but your entire future trajectory in the complex web of human relationships. In the weeks following the incident at Lorenzo's court, Alessandro's reputation throughout Florence began to undergo a remarkable transformation. Word of his gracious response to Francesco's attack spread quickly through the interconnected network of nobles, merchants, and political figures that constituted the city's elite. But the story that circulated was not simply about Alessandro's clever comeback or Francesco's failed attack. Instead, it became a narrative about character, wisdom, and the kind of person one wanted as an ally, partner, or associate. Those who had witnessed the exchange found themselves speaking not about Alessandro's business failures, which had been Francesco's intended focus, but about his remarkable composure and wisdom under pressure. They talked about his philosophical perspective on setbacks, his generosity towards someone who had attacked him, and his apparent immunity to the kind of petty social warfare that consumed so many of their peers. Machiavelli noted that this shift in narrative was not accidental but was the natural consequence of Alessandro's strategic response. By refusing to accept the frame of reference imposed by his humiliator, Alessandro had forced everyone present to evaluate the situation using different criteria. Instead of judging him based on business success or failure, they were judging him based on character, maturity, and social grace. And, by these criteria, Alessandro's performance had been exemplary. More importantly, the incident had revealed something significant about the social dynamics within Lorenzo's court. Francesco's attack had shown him to be the kind of person who would use private information to publicly embarrass a rival. This revelation caused many people to reassess their relationship with him. If Francesco was willing to betray Alessandro's confidence for social advantage, what might he do with information about them? If Francesco took pleasure in others' difficulties, could he really be trusted as a friend or ally? Alessandro, by contrast, had demonstrated exactly the opposite qualities. His response showed him to be someone who could handle adversity with grace, who would not be drawn into petty conflicts, and who possessed the emotional intelligence to transform potentially destructive situations into opportunities for demonstrating wisdom. These were exactly the qualities that made someone valuable as a partner in the complex political and commercial environment of Renaissance Florence. Within a month of the incident, Alessandro found himself receiving invitations to opportunities that had previously been closed to him. Established merchants approached him about joint ventures, recognizing that his experience with both success and failure made him a more valuable partner than someone who had never been tested. Political figures began to seek his counsel, appreciating his demonstrated ability to maintain perspective under pressure. Social hostesses competed to include him at their gatherings, knowing that his presence would elevate the tone of their events. Meanwhile, Francesco's position began to deteriorate in subtle but significant ways. People became more cautious about sharing information with him, uncertain about how he might use it. His invitations to exclusive gatherings became less frequent as hosts worried about potential conflicts. His opinions carried less weight in political discussions as people remembered his petty attack on Alessandro and questioned his judgment. This reversal of fortunes illustrated one of Machiavelli's most important insights about the nature of power. Reputation is the ultimate currency in human affairs, and how you handle challenges to your dignity directly impacts how others perceive your character. Alessandro's strategic response had enhanced his reputation while Francesco's attack had damaged his own. But Machiavelli observed something even more profound in the long-term consequences of Alessandro's approach. By transforming a moment of potential humiliation into a demonstration of wisdom and grace, Alessandro had not merely defended himself, he had established a new identity within the social hierarchy of Florence. He was no longer simply a young nobleman with mixed business results, he was now someone known for his philosophical depth, emotional maturity, and ability to handle adversity with distinction. This new identity opened doors that his previous status never could have. When other nobles faced their own challenges and setbacks, they began to seek Alessandro's advice, remembering how skillfully he had handled his own difficulties. When business ventures required partners who could maintain perspective during inevitable complications, Alessandro's name rose to the top of the list. When political situations demanded someone who could navigate complex social dynamics without creating additional conflicts, Alessandro became the obvious choice. The transformation was so complete that within a year of Francesco's attack, Alessandro's business setbacks were remembered not as failures but as part of his educational journey, evidence of his willingness to take risks and learn from experience. The very information that Francesco had hoped would destroy Alessandro's reputation had become part of a narrative that enhanced it. This outcome revealed the deepest level of Machiavelli's strategy. When you respond to humiliation with wisdom rather than emotion, you create a new story about who you are. Instead of allowing your humiliator to define you through their attack, you seize control of the narrative and use it to establish your identity on your own terms. Alessandro had accomplished something that went far beyond winning a single confrontation with Francesco. He had demonstrated the kind of person he was under pressure, and that demonstration had become the foundation for enhanced relationships, new opportunities, and increased influence throughout Florence. His response to humiliation had become the launching point for a higher level of success than he had previously achieved. Machiavelli recognized that this transformation was available to anyone who understood the true dynamics of power and human nature. The key was to recognize that humiliation, while painful in the moment, was actually an opportunity to demonstrate qualities that are impossible to display under normal circumstances. Most people never have the chance to show their grace under pressure, their wisdom in the face of attack, or their ability to transform conflict into opportunity. When someone attempts to humiliate you, they unwittingly provide you with exactly such an opportunity. The strategy required a fundamental shift in perspective about what humiliation represents. Instead of seeing it as an attack to be repelled or an injury to be healed, Machiavelli encouraged viewing it as raw material to be transformed into advantage. The humiliator believes they are exposing your weakness, but they are actually providing you with a platform to demonstrate your strength. This perspective transforms the entire experience of being humiliated. Instead of feeling victimized and defensive, you can feel grateful for the opportunity to show your true character. Instead of focusing on the immediate pain of the attack, you can focus on the long-term benefits of handling it skillfully. Instead of seeing your humiliator as an enemy who has harmed you, you can see them as someone who has inadvertently provided you with a valuable gift. The final element of Machiavelli's strategy involves understanding that your response to humiliation becomes part of your permanent reputation. People remember not just what happened to you, but how you handled what happened to you. Alessandro's gracious response to Francesco's attack became one of the defining stories about his character, told and retold throughout Florence for years afterward. It established him as someone of exceptional wisdom and emotional intelligence, opening doors that remained closed to those who had never faced such challenges or had failed to meet them with distinction. Years later, when Lorenzo himself faced criticism and attack from his political opponents, it was Alessandro he turned to for counsel on how to respond. The young nobleman who had once been humiliated for business failures had become Florence's most trusted advisor on handling political pressure and maintaining dignity under fire. His transformation from apparent victim to acknowledged expert represented the ultimate vindication of Machiavelli's darkest strategy. The incident that had begun with Francesco's attempted humiliation had become the foundation for Alessandro's rise to genuine influence and respect. By refusing to accept the terms of engagement imposed by his attacker, by inverting the apparent meaning of the assault, and by playing the long game of reputation and character, Alessandro had transformed a moment of potential defeat into the launching point for lasting success. This is the essence of Machiavelli's darkest strategy. When others attempt to humiliate you, they provide you with the raw material for your own elevation. They reveal their character while giving you the opportunity to demonstrate yours. They attempt to diminish you while actually creating the conditions for your enhancement. The key is to recognize these opportunities when they arise and to have the wisdom and emotional discipline to respond strategically rather than reactively. In the complex theater of human relationships, humiliation is not the ending of your story, it is the beginning of a new chapter in which you have the opportunity to define yourself on your own terms. Those who understand this principle, as Alessandro did and as Machiavelli observed, discover that their greatest challenges become their greatest advantages, and that those who seek to destroy them actually become the unwitting architects of their success. The morning sun that had cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Renaissance Florence when this story began had long since given way to the twilight of a world transformed. But the principles that Alessandro demonstrated and Machiavelli codified continue to illuminate the path for anyone who faces the inevitable humiliations and challenges that come with living among other human beings. In the end, it is not what happens to us that defines us, but how we choose to respond to what happens to us. And in that choice lies the difference between those who allow others to write their stories and those who seize the pen and write their own.